Hi there. Welcome to lesson 3.5, chapter 3, lesson 5 on Unity for Theatre. We are going to talk about user interface, just at a very basic level, just to get you started. User interfaces are really good if you've got a 3D scene, but you want to have some buttons or some controls around the outside, or maybe just want to stick a logo in the corner or something, just a watermark. So we're just going to talk about that briefly. The first thing I need to show you is there's a button up here called 2D. It's really useful when you're working in UIs because you end up looking at something flat on. If you hit 2D, it just moves the screen round, so you're now looking flat on, straight at the plane where the UI would sit. If you hit it again, you jump back into 3D, and double click on something like my lights, it'll bring us back to the scene that we're working on. Now, the first thing you need when you're building a UI is a canvas. It's the beginning of everything. So let's right click and go to UI, and you can see in here a whole load of things. Now, the canvas is an item you can click on, and you can build that first. But if you click on any of these, if it hasn't got a canvas, it will build one for you automatically because it just can't do it without. So let's create some text. You see right now it's created a canvas with a text layer. So everything to do with the UI has to sit under that canvas, and you can have multiple canvases, but that's the basic one. It's also created for us an event system. The event system is needed to allow the interaction, i.e. clicking on buttons and make things happen. So it builds that for you automatically as well. So the text has jumps in here. We can actually see the canvas. We couldn't see it before, but there's this white line here that's appeared. Now what that is this UI. Now you can see how small our 3D scene is, okay, because we work in sort of meters for our scene, and that would live probably around here. The UI is something completely different. The UI is done by pixels, and it's based on the size of your screen. It's actually based on whatever you've got in your game window here. It starts to build things. And you can see there, my game window, it's showing already new text in the corner. So that's how big it appears on the actual window that you create. And in here, you see that's it there in the corner. All right, so give you an idea just how big this canvas is. There it is. And our scene is right down there in the bottom. So it might be useful for you to move the canvas right out of the way of your scene if you could, because you don't want to get a 3D model at the bottom of your UI. It's possible to have a 3D model. Like for instance, if I built a cube and made it, let's make it 1,000 by 1,000. So it's really, really big, and let's push it right into there. That will now appear in your UI because it's, oh, no, it's not there. It's in the way. So something to think about is where your canvas sits. Now, I think the reason I didn't show it just now is because there's something I want to show you, which is the render mode, which is the first thing you need to know. First, you've got screen space, which means it sits over the top of your screen, so it's got a nice frame. It's always based on the screen itself. But you've also got screen space based on the camera, so you can load a camera up. So we've got a camera already in the scene. It's not having it though. Main camera. There we go. And what does it do there? Now that UI has jumped down there because that's where we got a camera. So now when our camera moves, the UI moves with it. And if I go to game mode, you'll see if I click on play, as I move the camera around, still hear my propellers. The camera doesn't want to move. I have to move the camera in game mode, but I haven't got any controls for that. But the text will move with it because it's trying to look for it. And the other thing you can see is I've changed this game window. Look, if I change this window here, I'll drag it over here. If I move this, you'll see that the window changes. It's trying to update itself so it understands what you're creating. So if you've got a game that's running on a monitor like mine, actually my monitor is one of those really wide ones, that's actually what the game's got to try and render. So your window changes. Now what does that do to the text? The text has now disappeared because it's so far down here. You can see it down there. So there's loads of things to think about with when you're building your UI. So let's just go and jump back out of game mode and go back. So that one was the camera mode in screen space. And then you've got world space. Now this is quite cool because if you want to put text into your scene, you can use world space and we can scale it right down. So at the moment let's just give it 0, 0, 0. Let's give it rotation of 0, 0, 0. So it's nice and square. It's got a very small scale, but let's delete our cube out of the way and jump down to our main camera, which is down here. Okay, pointing that way. I'm going to take this canvas and I can now move it around the scene, just like I would a 3D object. I'm going to scale it and notice my text scales with it. And I'm actually going to spin it around because I think it's facing the wrong direction. So which direction do I move it? I'll drag that one, rotation there, I'll make that 180, and bring it into my scene a bit more. No idea if that's in the camera's view or not. They make it a little bit smaller. So if I want to just place something in the scene as a 3D object, but I don't want a plane, I don't want to create those as 3D objects, I can just bring that in. And if I click on game, yeah, look, you can see it there, existing as just a free floating bit of text in the middle of my scene. So that's quite cool. So that's where you might have two canvases. You might have one that lives in the scene and one that doesn't. So let's just create a new one. I'm just going to close that for the second. Let's create a new canvas that lives in the real world, like as in on the screen. UI, and this time I'm going to create a button. And there, look, we've got a giant button now. So let's jump to 2D, and let's double click on the canvas to make it full size. Okay, and this is where it's useful to drag out the game mode, because then you can see what it actually looks like. That's the actual button, and it will do things. And we're going to cover how to make buttons work later on, but yeah, just so you know that it's there. So I might just create two windows here, put that one there, split it in half, and I can set an aspect ratio. So I could say it's going to be full HD, so it now modifies itself to be HD, even though it's only using half my screen. And you can see there in my 2D view of my scene where the button is. Now if I click the button there, I can move it around. I can see where it is relative to the canvas, so I can put it up there. Now that lives in the top left-hand corner of my screen. You can also do it up here by moving it around. What's handy about this is that these are absolute values. This is the actual distance from what's known as a pivot, and the pivot in this case is set to be the middle of the screen. So if I set this to 0, 0, 0, it's now in the middle of the screen. I've got a button right there in the middle. Now the problem is if I start scaling things around this, if I want this to be in the top left-hand corner up here, like that, and now I'm working on, let's say I've got to 4K, there you go, it's no longer in the corner because it's trying to measure that same distance away from the center pivot. So this is where we've got the pivot controls up here. So I'll go back to HD, and I'll change this to be left-hand corner. So now it knows that it's got to try and pivot from that corner, very far left. And these numbers are changed now. So now this is the distance X from the side and minus 40 from the top, okay? And if I jump this over to 4K to see what it looks like on a 4K screen, it stays where it was. And that's because it's relative to that corner. So what you tend to find is when you're building a UI, you'll put things around the edges or in the middle, and you need to make sure you've got your pivots set correctly. So it always pivots from those points. And you've got plenty of choices. You've got 9 points, and you can even tell it to stretch or move itself around if it needs to, if something moves in ways you're not expecting. So the final thing I'm going to show you with the canvas, because there's loads of things to show you here, that there's drop-down menus and sliders and all sorts of things. But I want to show you a raw image. I can never remember which one is best to go for. I'm going to try raw image. So this just creates a square, and you can see it there. I'm going to set its width to 400 by 400. Ooh. So it's nice and big, and that's again based on pixels. It's 400 pixels by 400 pixels on your screen, as opposed to 400 units of measurements in the 3D scene. I'm going to leave it centered to the middle, and here I can add a texture or a material. You've got the choice. Normally you have to put a texture into a material, but with a UI you can insert a texture into it. This has to be a sprite, and I'm covering sprites in chapter 4, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. But basically, if you've got an image that's already been built, let's just find something. Let's choose this. Is quite cool. There you go. I've now imported that image, and now that lives in the scene. So that might be your logo. It could be a company logo, and then you can decide to pivot it from the bottom right. I'm going to put it down here in the corner, and I'm going to scale it. But rather than scale it, I'm going to change the width and the height. It's always good to keep the scale on, to 1, and use the pixels, because it relates more to your content you're bringing in, if it's coming from Photoshop or InDesign or Illustrator, whatever you're doing. So I'm going to have a 200 by 200 pixel logo in the corner, which just happens to be the chevron stripes. There we go. And I can see it in my game mode. I can jump that over to full HD, and it's still there. It's quite big now because 200 pixels on a full HD is quite large. I can even go to free aspect. and I can now move this around. Let's drag it. Come on. Undock it, and I'm going to stretch this and move it. No matter what size I make it, that content will always try to latch itself to the bottom right, and the button's going to try and latch itself to the top left. And you can see in the scene view that it's constantly updating itself to make sure that's the case. There you go. And of course, it can go wrong. Eventually, you just literally break it and you just can't handle it anymore. And that's worth noticing if you're building anything out for phones, because phone resolutions, if you're dealing with phones that are up to 8 years old, they've changed in resolution so much that you could build something that fits fine on a giant Samsung phablet, but you use it on one of the old iPhones, or even some of the new iPhones that are tiny, you lose your user interface around the outside. So worth knowing. Incidentally, we'll come to it later, but if you loaded up an iPhone package, so in build settings, if you changed your build method to iOS or Android, the settings in here will also include all the different types of phone that system can build to. So you've got iPhone 10s, iPhone 9s. You can go in there and choose those in both portrait and landscape mode, so you can check what your UI looks like on different phone types. I think it's quite sensible to work mostly in HD and Quad HD if you're working in a PC or Mac environment. They scale quite nicely because screens tend to be the same 16:9 ratio, which is why you've also got the 16:9 aspects here as well. So that's kind of the HD look. And as they scale up, it kind of pretty much stays there. You might get a little bit of stretching and warping, but 16:9 is a good place to start. So that's the end of UI, and that's also the end of chapter 3. In chapter 4, we're going to be looking at a lot more detail about textures, materials, sprites, and shaders. So we'll get on to that. And if you've got any questions or any feedback so far on this training course, please send some feedback through YouTube. You can contact me directly from my website, or make sure you're sharing it around, like and subscribe and all that stuff, because it's good for me to get the feedback and get the user base to help me produce more videos. Okay, see you in the next chapter.